is to, because I keep putting new stuff in there, the electronic versions of the handouts are in there, the tape recordings of the previous sessions are in there, which, you probably don't want to go through all these things twice, but it can be useful to have access to that if you missed something. If you, and then there's a number of, I think, treasures or pictures of Sellers in the surround. There's an audio recording of him dictating one of his papers. I did throw in PDFs of the New Realism and Critical Realism compendia from the early years of the 20th century, which you might as well file away on your hard drive too, just in case at some point you want to have a look at them. So do be checking in there. So I want to. I'm mainly going to talk about this outline of a philosophy of language paper that we unearthed from that Sellers never published. It's not really a publishable tape, but that I think fills in a picture of how he's thinking at this time in a really interesting and useful way. But first, I want to do a little more historical background. T.S. Eliot imagines an interlocutor saying to him, why should we read the dead? We know so much more than they do. And Eliot's reply to that is, yes, and they're what we know. That's why we should read them. My view is that the only defense that one has against being held hostage to or captive by the contingencies of the current state of the philosophical literature is to have experience at seeing how other literatures fit into their historical background and have some sense of a running start on getting up to where we are today, some sense of how we got into the pickle that we're in. So I've been filling in the background on Sellers a little bit, but there's at least one significant portion of it that I haven't addressed, really waved my hands at, that we do need to fill in what I think of as maybe the most important philosophical debate of the 20th century. Certainly it's one of the framing debates of the philosophy of the 20th century. And that's the epic battle between naturalism and empiricism. This has come up a couple of times before. Remember on the set of quotations from Sellers that I distributed the first time, the very first two were the index passages of right-wing and left-wing Sellarsians from EPM, the Scientia Mensura passage, in the dimension of describing and explaining the world, science is the measure of all things, of what is that it is, and of what is not that it is not. That's a statement of his, something like a definitive statement of his scientific naturalism. And the second one, in characterizing an episode or state as one of knowing, we're not giving an empirical description of it, of that episode or state. We're placing it in the logical space of reasons, of justifying and being able to justify what one says. Now, that's a statement of his anti-descriptivism. Sometimes in these early things he'll talk about anti-factualism. He uses the term psychologism as a species of that genus. This anti-descriptivism, anti-psychologism, anti-factualism, he sometimes talks about this as scientism. But I think the anti-descriptivism is the most careful statement of it. That's one of the two main principles that he uses in his critique of empiricism, in Empiricism and the Philosophy of Mind. That empiricism is committing the descriptivist fallacy, making a descriptivist mistake. The other principal pillar of his complaint about empiricism and the main basis for his assault on the myth of the given is his inferentialism, his semantic inferentialism. But we see in this founding, or anyway, passage that epitomizes what the left-wing Solorsians admire about him, anti-descriptivism. This is one of the main considerations he's going to use in his assault on empiricism. I mentioned that we should be careful to mark terminologically and make the conceptual distinction between Sellers' scientific naturalism and his scientific realism. The scientific realism is his view about theoretical entities, that they're ontologically no different from observable entities, and it contrasts with the instrumentalism of logical empiricism. Sellers always was a realist. Remember in the opening passage of the Epistemology and the New Way of Words that we looked at last time, he says the general perspective of the present paper can best be indicated by saying that the author is a rationalistic realist who's deserted to the camp of logical empiricism. Now, giving up his rationalism for empiricism, okay, that's what made it seem like a big move to him. His critique of empiricism in EPM is going to be from the side of rationalism. He comes back at least to a middle position. One of the principal points at issue between McDowell and me on reading EPM is that I take Sellers basically to have driven a stake through the heart of empiricism, sort of tout court, whereas McDowell is more concerned with what Sellers still endorses of an empiricism and sees a rehabilitated version of empiricism that Sellers still endorses. Either way, we agree it's a rationalist critique, so you end up with a sort of rationalist, inferentialist specifically, version of empiricism. But that's where it's coming from. The realism, he never gave up. It's sort of disingenuous for him to have put it this way. It heightened the literary force of this remark. I've shifted from being a rationalist realist to being a logical empiricist because the logical empiricists were notoriously instrumentalists about theoretical entities. The only realist in the Vienna Circle was Feigl, who you remember was Sellers' professional mentor. You remember the remark that Sellers said for many years he and Feigl were two separated portions of one entity. Feigl was, for at least a decade, something like Sellers' Carnap whisperer, since Feigl had known him from the beginning in the Vienna Circle. Sellers could always find out about Carnap back in the day and even the latest things from Feigl. Realism was one of the things that Feigl and Sellers had together. But the naturalism is a different point. Recall also that last time in discussing analytic philosophy, sort of how could we characterize this movement as various as it's been over more than a century? And the characterization I offered was that what tied all the different phases and aspects of analytic philosophy together was the aspiration to use the conceptual tools of modern logic, really the Frege-Russell logic, to explain the relationship between two sets of concepts, or as I'd rather say, two vocabularies, some problematic target vocabularies, semantic vocabulary, intentional vocabulary, maybe normative vocabulary, to understand those problematic vocabularies and the concepts they express in terms of unproblematic base vocabularies by somehow elaborating the problematic concepts out of the base concepts using logical vocabulary. And I sort of thought of this way, the two core programs of analytic philosophy were the empiricist program in epistemology and the naturalist program in ontology, that the empiricist base vocabularies varied from things like phenomenal or phenomenological vocabulary, or maybe secondary quality vocabulary, or maybe just observational vocabulary, that the naturalist base vocabularies were again varied, or maybe the vocabulary of fundamental physics, or maybe of natural sciences generally, or maybe just of empirical descriptive vocabulary. And the specific relations that you were supposed to achieve between these vocabularies, well, that varied too. You could conceive it in terms of analysis or definition or translation, or different varieties of reduction, truth-making, supervenience. Those were all different varieties of the analytic conception, but still some variety of empiricism and some variety of naturalism were the dominant core programs. Sellers, the tradition that Sellers inherited from his father, the tradition of new realism and critical realism, well, in Roy Wood, Sellers' two books, one of them called Critical Realism, the other one called Evolutionary Naturalism. Evolutionary naturalism was a non-reductive scientific naturalism. Critical realism was a non-reductive empiricist epistemology. So from that tradition also, empiricism and naturalism were the main streams of thought. I mentioned the Vienna Circle. The biggest divide within the Vienna Circle was between all of whom self-identified as empiricists and naturalists, but when there was a conflict between them, as notoriously there had been in traditional empiricism in traditional British empiricism over alethic modal vocabulary, lawfulness, when there was, which you could hardly be a naturalist without, and yet which was suspect from an empiricist epistemological point of view. The divide within the Vienna Circle, the big divide, was when these collided, when push came to shove, did you stay with the naturalism or did you stay with the empiricism? Neurath was the leader of the group that said no, the naturalism was more important. Schlick was the leader of the group who said no, the empiricism was more important. Carnap was torn between these his entire career, even though he was convinced that there was a way to bring these together. That in the next generation, the two biggest critiques of empiricism came from Quine and from Sellers. The Quine of Two Dogmas of Empiricism and Carnap on Logical Truth, and the Sellers of Empiricism and the Philosophy of Mind. Both of them remained committed scientific naturalists throughout their lives, and in both of their work, Quine's and Sellers, there remained an unresolved tension between the empiricism and the naturalism. So this has been a theme throughout really the 20th century, that there were empiricist impulses and naturalist impulses, and they often were in tension with one another. Yeah.
Can you just name a couple of individuals in the Vienna Circle who found elethic modal vocabulary problematic?
Well, I mean, Carnap found semantic vocabulary and elethic modal vocabulary suspect right up until meaning and necessity in the 50s. And Schlick never accepted modal vocabulary. In the Echo generation, neither did Quine. In spite of his criticisms of empiricism and his thoroughgoing scientific naturalism, he always insisted that modal vocabulary was literally unintelligible, and that modal logic only engendered an illusion of understanding, was the phrase there. So this was this tension was generally appreciated. And what I'd like to say a little bit about today is classical American pragmatism, as far as its contribution to the debate between empiricism and naturalism, or the collision between these. I mean, the British empiricists all thought of themselves as naturalists. Hume notoriously aspired to be the Newton of the mind. That they wanted to bring, to be the philosophers of the new science. And yet, what tied them together was their epistemological empiricism. And it was very difficult on empiricist grounds to see how we could know what was a law rather than a merely universal regularity. And yet, the introduction of laws of nature was at the center of the Newtonian revolution. Now, I mentioned in my brief gesture at classical American pragmatism as one of the streams of philosophical thought that come together in Sellers and in Quine, that I think Cheryl Mezak is right about classical American pragmatism in her observation that there really were two wings of classical American pragmatism as well. The one that springs most easily to mind is the William James to John Dewey line of thought, whose later avatar is Richard Rorty. That was the pragmatism that he picked up. But Mezak points out that that more popular form of pragmatism has dominated our picture of it, that there was a more technical strand of pragmatism that cared about logic, that cared about philosophy of science, and that was not in nearly as much tension with analytic philosophy as the other strand was. And this one runs from Charles Sanders Peirce through the semiotician Charles Morris and C.I. Lewis, who was the founder of modern modal logic, as well as the greatest American neo-Kantian of his generation. And that's the strand that runs then through Quine, through Sellers, and that contemporary neo-pragmatists like me and Hugh Price would identify with as the sort of pragmatism that we're aiming to develop and continue. So I just want to register that I think that is an important distinction between two wings of American pragmatism. But what I want to talk about is what unifies them rather than what divides them. Why we're right to think of them as marching under a banner labeled Classical American Pragmatism. And I want to start off by contrasting two ways of thinking about the pragmatists. One way of thinking that I think is probably the dominant one is that it was really a minor parochial philosophical movement that was theoretically derivative and practically and politically, in the end, inconsequential. That's what Bertrand Russell thought about it. That's what Heidegger thought about it. Mandarins speaking for two very different philosophical traditions, but united in their contempt for and dismissal of pragmatism. From this point of view, it was an American echo in the last part of the 19th century of the British utilitarianism of the first part of the 19th century. And what they have in common, what's echoed, is esteeming a crass shopkeeper's sensibility that sees everything through the reductive lenses of comparative profit and loss. So Bentham and Mill had sought a secular basis for moral, political, and social theory, basically in the bluff bourgeois bookkeeping habits of the competitive egoist, the one for whom the form of a reason for action, is an answer to the question, what's in it for me? And from this point of view, James and Dewey show up as adopting this conception of practical reason and extending it to the theoretical sphere of epistemology, semantics, and the philosophy of mind. So that rationality, not now just practical rationality as it was with Bentham and Mill, rationality in general appears as instrumental intelligence, as a generalized capacity for getting what one wants. From this point of view, the truth is what works. Knowledge is a species of the useful, and mind and language are tools, ultimately, for getting what we want. And when Russell and Heidegger look at this, they see the instinctive, reductive materialism and anti-intellectualism of uncultivated common sense being given the refined form of a philosophical theory. So if one objects to the project of founding morality on instrumental reason, or thinks that there's more to reason than instrumental reason, then pragmatism conceived in this way is not of permanent value. It is rightly seen as, this conception is rightly seen as the progenitor of contemporary rational choice theory, decision theory, game theory, which is, for better or for worse, the dominant methodology of the social sciences of our day. But nothing comparable can be said about the pragmatists' extension of instrumentalism from practical reasoning, where rational choice theory works, to the theoretical realm. That idea has essentially vanished without a trace. In American philosophy, the heyday of Dewey quickly gave way to the heyday of Carnap. Carnap's logical empiricism just pushed Dewey and pragmatism off stage. Analytic philosophy then combined the German and Austrian with the Native American, with the British, to form American analytic philosophy. And though pragmatism did have some prominent heirs, Gordy, later Putnam, there aren't many contemporary American philosophers working in core areas of semantics, philosophy of language, philosophy of mind, who would identify as pragmatists. It really has not been influential. That's one view. I want to present a different way of thinking about it. If you look at American pragmatism through the lens of a concern with naturalism, empiricism, and the relationship between them, I think you see something quite different. Then I think you can see American pragmatism as a movement of world historical significance, as the announcement, commencement, and a first formulation of the fighting faith of a second enlightenment. The pragmatists, like their predecessors, the philosophes of the first enlightenment, treat reason as the sovereign force in human life. And like the philosophers of the first enlightenment, reason in that capacity is to be understood on the model provided by the best science, the best natural science of the times. The form of understanding distinctive of the best science of their times is the distilled essence of reason for the pragmatists as for the original Enlightenment thinkers. But there's a crucial difference. The difference is the difference in the best science of their day. The philosophical picture that emerges from taking the science as the model of rationality is very different in the two cases. And I want to claim that the naturalism and empiricism that they developed fit together with each other much better than did the naturalism and empiricism of traditional British empiricists or of the other 20th century figures, in particular the logical empiricist successors of theirs. The sort of understanding that they saw was shaped by what they saw as the two big conceptual revolutions in science in the 19th century. Principal among those, of course, was Darwinian evolution, the notion of natural selection. And second was the introduction of statistical explanation, originally in the social sciences, but quickly adapted in physics in the form of thermodynamics, which was just coming to its definitive statement when Peirce was a physics student. I think we should think about this, anyway, I find it helpful to think about this in the context of the perspective that Michael Friedman has given us on Kant. He says, with the neo-Kantians, think of Kant first and foremost as a philosopher of natural science. In that regard, he agrees with the neo-Kantians of the second half of the 19th century. That's the core of Kant's thought, is his attempt to understand Newtonian science and to understand us as knowers, granting that the paradigm of knowledge is Newtonian physics. But Friedman adds a qualification that the German neo-Kantians weren't in a position to add, and that is that Kant is a brilliant philosopher of science, but a brilliant philosopher essentially of 18th century science. And Friedman wants, on that basis, to lower our expectations of how much good Kant is going to do us today in thinking about our philosophical puzzles. We can appreciate his brilliance, but we need to divide through by the fact that science has moved on since then. And what were brilliant philosophical rethinkings of the foundations of science, of Newtonian physics, have, in Friedman's view, only very limited application to our own day. This is Michael Friedman's particular take, as Kant in the Formal Sciences, his book. Now, I actually think there's a lot more in Kant that can be taken over from for today than Friedman does, but it's a very illuminating take on Kant. And I want to look at the classical American pragmatists in the same way, to contrast the way they're thinking with previous movements of thought, contrast their naturalism and empiricism based on the best science of their time, evolutionary theory and statistical explanation, whose paradigm for them was, well, for Peirce, who's the one, as the founder member of this movement, is the one who pulled these ideas together, statistical mechanics in physics. So one difference between taking your paradigm of scientific understanding to be Newtonian physics and taking it to be Darwinian biology is the modality that's involved. The modality of Newtonian physics was necessity, the necessity of universal, exceptionless laws. You explain something in the Newtonian sense by showing that it followed necessarily from universal, exceptionless laws. The DN model of explanation, deductive nomological model of explanation, that's Hempel's name for it, explaining something by showing it's an instance of a universal law of nature, that really was the form of explanation that taking Newtonian physics as the paradigm of understanding something gave rise to. By contrast, both evolutionary explanation and statistical explanation explain things that are admitted to be contingent occurrences, things that could have happened differently. And nonetheless, you can give an evolutionary explanation of why this thing that need not have happened did happen, or statistically, this thing that need not have happened, but was at least probable that you could show it, so you can understand it in that way. Both Darwinian evolution and statistical explanation are ways of making intelligible the contingent emergence of some kind of order from a more random background. And that's a very different sort of modality of understanding than the Newtonian one. Now, the original subject matter of evolutionary explanation was, of course, the process by which biological species arise and diversify. But Peirce, taking his cue from the way statistical explanation had been adapted from its original home in social sciences to physics substantially generalized evolutionary and statistical forms of intelligibility along two different dimensions. One idea that's absolutely central to the pragmatists was seeing a common structure to the evolution of species and the acquisition of habits by individuals through learning. There was a common selectional structure to those, where some features or habits are rewarded and become more common, whether those are features of species or of behavior. They saw evolution and learning as instances of one selectional technique. In the case of learning, it may be supervised learning, where the selection is intentional by a teacher, or it may be unsupervised learning by trial and error, where you're seeing what works, what's a successful response to things. But they saw this commonality between evolution and learning, a common selectional structure. And again, a structure whereby order could emerge from chaos beforehand, from random habits and random variations. And this made it possible for thinking of learning as the evolution of habits by selection. The more successful habits are reinforced, made it possible to see a cognitive continuum that has natural science as its high end, but has the learned behavior of successful predators as another instance of it, sort of at the low end, and in between all of our sort of usual toings and froings. The other dimension that Peirce generalized this notion on was to the inorganic world. Instead of thinking of laws of nature as immutable, eternal, exceptionless regularities, he thought of them as habits that had been selected competitively in an environment consisting of the other regularities and habits that they were. He generalized this notion of a habit to think of regularities of the way physical things work as like habits, which are selected depending on how well they can be sustained in an environment that consists of other competing habits. And he thought of what had appeared to the Newtonians as exceptionless laws of nature as merely particularly robust habits, which had emerged by a process of selection, but which might not be eternal, might, in competition with other ones, pass away in favor of others. And he saw statistical regularities as habits that just weren't as robust as that only supported statistical explanations. So he really saw a continuum on the physical side, too, between statistical regularities and special laws that hold only given the right environment for them, the right conditions.
Yeah, so I guess like in natural selection, like what's sort of driving the whole thing is that like animals die and fail to reproduce. So like what's driving?
He's thinking of the habits as reproducing.
What's like what's the thing that like that all of these habits are like sort of fighting against, and only one of them succeeds better than the others?
The way he's thinking about it, it's just the survival of the habit. and nobody's trying to do anything, but some of the regularities persist in the context of others and continue. Others alter, and some of them just stop, things stop behaving that way. So he's thinking of this as selection just as a matter of survival. The regularity, sort of the reproductive family in Ruth Milliken's way of thinking about this just is the regularity. And the question is, well, does this regularity continue given that these other things are happening or not? And some of them do, and are at least locally exceptionless, locally in space and time, he's thinking, and others of them are only much more locally.
Just a point of information on that fact. So at the time that Proust was writing, there were multiple theories of evolution. So like Lamarckian evolution was on the table too, which was different from Darwinian in that like giraffes get taller because they like try to get taller and then they get taller over time in that way, and it wasn't necessarily like, there are different pictures of evolution on the table than just like dying off.
So you're thinking that, are you saying that Proust might not have been thinking on a Darwinian, but rather on a Lamarckian paradigm?
I think it's possible.
I think evolutionary love, you talk more to Marquis.
Mm-hmm. So there's like, by evolution, you could mean like dying off because you're not good enough, but you could also mean like trying to be something different.
Okay, so you can see how the naturalism coming from taking these new sciences as the paradigm looks very different from a Newtonian-inspired naturalism. But it also was coupled with a new form of empiricism. The experimental scientific method is just seen as the explicit principled distillation of a learning process, of a selectional learning process. Dewey's term for that process was experience. That's the axial concept of his central books, Experience in Nature and Art as Experience, to the point that Rorty says those books thin out as you realize that Dewey is in effect using the concept of experience as an incantatory device to blur every conceivable distinction. And that they can't actually read like that. But this is experience in the sense of the German word Erfahrung rather than Erlebnis. It's not Cartesian experiences, these self-intimating, glowing episodes. It's experience in the sense in which the job ad says 3 years experience necessary. You have to have been doing this and learning how to do it for 3 years. When the other job ad says no experience necessary, it's not inviting applications from zombies. It's saying, no, you don't have to have actually been through this process before. Deweyan experience is work in the sense of force through distance, and it's quite different from that Cartesian notion. But it's something that already, it's a process that has the structure of a test, operate, test, exit loop. Do something, see what the effect of that was, check that against what you were aiming at. Did that satisfy the desire? If not, do something else. Try that again until you do satisfy the desire or achieve the goal. That test, operate, test, exit, cycle structure Peirce sees as the same in scientific method and with a predator's learning how to stalk a new sort of prey. And you can see this as an epistemological basis. It's not aiming at a notion of knowledge as a state, but at a kind of practical understanding, mastery of, the acquisition of successful, flexible habits. So, the classical versions of naturalism and empiricism fit together much better than either the versions of the early modern Enlightenment or of the Vienna Circle. Far from being in tension with each other, they complement and mutually support one another. Both the world on the side of naturalism and our knowledge of it on the side of empiricism are construed on the same model as mutable, contingent products of statistical, selectional, adaptational processes that allow order to congeal, to pop to the surface and float on a sea of random variability. That's what's happening in the world, and that's what our learning and coming to understand it consists in. Both nature and our experience of it are understood in terms of this notion of the precipitation of adaptive habits, the selection of habits in an environment. So the pragmatists have a new notion of reason, a notion that they see as continuous. The theoretical physicist at one end and the culturally primitive hunter and the predator, the grooming and development of discursive habits. That's a learning process, but it's of a piece with the process by which the natural world develops its habits. The emblem of the pragmatists' understanding of reason was the flywheel governor for steam engines that automatically regulates the speed of the temperature of a furnace by the speed of the flywheel. Okay, that's the story I'd like to tell about classical empiricism. It's very different from the dismissive one. Thought of this way: if you think of philosophy during the 20th century from the point of view of views about empiricism and naturalism, tensions between them, and the attempt to synthesize what was right about empiricism and naturalism, American pragmatism really had something to contribute to this undertaking. And this is a view that both the principal critics of logical empiricism, Quine and Sellers, who were both greatly influenced by it, but came to be its greatest critics, they were both students of C.I. Lewis and great readers of Lewis and indeed of Peirce. So I want to add to the account of analytic philosophy generally, logical empiricism in the Vienna Circle in particular. So there was also a minor version of this in the new and critical realist tradition, but the American pragmatist tradition had its own distinctive contribution to make to this. Okay, anything anybody wants to say about that bit of potted history?
Yeah. I'm kind of curious. So you talked a lot about the general goals, or what you take to be what you can really draw out from classical pragmatism it's worthwhile. But I'm wondering also, what exactly is the status for you of Peirce's logical system, namely putting abduction front and center in the acquisition of habits and in the rational process? Do you think that can be replaced with the modern logical systems in a way that's still completely compatible with what you're trying to develop?
I mean, the air of, you're pointing to the feature of Peirce's logic and use of logic that is precisely reflecting these ideas, abduction to get us to a hypothesis, in effect, a habit, a rule here. And the contemporary air of that is inference to best explanation of the sort that Harman has championed, which he sees as built on top of our ordinary logic. What at least I refer to as the Harman point, not that he hasn't made others, is to distinguish between implication and inference, relations of implication and inferential practices. He did this most strikingly in arguing that there is no such thing as deductive inference. The argument was, well, if there were, a paradigm of it would be arguing from modus ponens, well, P, and if P then Q, therefore Q, concluding Q. If there were such a thing as deductive inference, that would be a paradigm of it. But look, you might have much better evidence against Q than you have for P or the conditional, and in that case you should reject P. What logic, relations of implication tell you is you shouldn't accept all of P, Q, and of P, if P then Q, and not Q. But it doesn't tell you what to do. For that, you have to look at an abductive process of inference to best explanation. And logic is best thought of as a constraint. The relations that logic describes are best thought of as a constraint on norms of reasoning. So I think of that as this sort of contemporary version of the Peircean point. And Peirce is somebody who gave us, after all, the distinction between semantics and pragmatics that one would use to make sense of this sort of view. Okay, good. Well, then let's look at these texts of Sellers. This document, the Outlines of a Philosophy of Language, Sellers never published it, never referred to it. We did catalog it and then digitize it in the archive. But there's a lot of stuff that's true of that no human being has looked at. This was unearthed by a Sellers scholar, Boris Brandhoff of Bonn University, who came here for a year to work on the archive, and who I think probably knows more about the Sellarsian corpus than any other carbon-based life form. Just has spent the time in the archive, and this is one of the pearls that he came back with from his dive, and we're going to publish it in the ongoing series of Sellers collected papers in the next volume called Fraught with Aught, after a phrase of Sellers, which will be the first time that sort of the rest of the world has looked at this thing. I think it's a real treasure, and that it will be particularly significant when you're looking back from seeing some of the mature works to see some of those ideas coming together here. I'd particularly like to recommend it as a topic for term papers, because if you can make something philosophical out of this text, there's a very good chance that it would be a publishable thing, because the Sellers world has never read this text. They're simply not aware of the existence of it, even though it's publicly available in the archive. But as I say, you have to find it in there. So anyway, it is, I think, for multiple reasons, a good thing to focus on, to write something about. It's a funny document that we have. He says in the footnote that he's boiled this down from something much larger. So far, we haven't found trace of the larger thing. You can see that he didn't just make that up. He really did. What we have seems to be, this thing is set up in the Tractarian sort of number system, which is about as annoying as it usually is when people arrange things that way. But the triple asterisks do seem to correspond to extended omissions from the original text. We don't know how many propositions there were. Were there the canonical 7 from it? There were at least 3, because he has a chunk from the middle of 3 that he tacks on at the end. Anything after it he decided was confused, and all the stuff in between. And we don't know whether anybody else ever saw the longer thing. He says this draft is only to be circulated at the groups of this conference that we have not been able to find anything out about, that apparently the Rockefeller Foundation funded in La Jolla in 1950. Who else was at that conference? We simply do not know these things. And even the question of how it was circulated. This was 1950. There were not Xerox machines. This was not mimeographed, which was the sort of reproductive machinery if you needed to make 20 copies of something. Other than that, there were just carbon copies from a typewriter. Was this really circulated that way? If so, it had to be retyped a couple of times. Well, we have a couple of a couple of copies of the typed one. That's why there's 3 consecutive copies of the same thing. If you look at that document, they scanned all of them in case they were different. They aren't. They seem to be exactly the same. And yet they're not carbon copies of each other either. So it seems like the secretary was made to type these things out multiple times, so that the participants at this conference could read them. So that's a lot of effort to go to for that. Some other things I'll point out about it. Outline of a philosophy of language. Almost nobody used the expression philosophy of language in those days. You can look at, say, the Google Ngram viewer for the use of this phrase. Philosophy of science was barely used in these days. Philosophy of science in English started to get used around 1930. Carnap responsible for it. And grew during the 1950s with the Philosophy of Science Center in Minnesota, and then really took off in the 60s. It was part of pushing what is falling in that regard. Philosophy of language really didn't get any play until Quine's Word and Object, which he described. That was the topic of it, philosophy of language. And for the next 20 or 30 years, philosophy of language was a big deal. Now it's maybe contracting as a narrower specialty. When Rorty, as his first book-length publication, edited the book The Linguistic Turn, and wrote his very influential introduction to it in the mid-60s, bringing to more general philosophical consciousness the character of this revolution, what Sellers had called the new way of words, a phrase that Rorty mentions, but that didn't itself catch on in the way the linguistic turn did. Rorty saw two wings of, two versions of the linguistic turn. One of them was metalinguistic. That was Carnap and the Vienna Circle, saying really philosophical questions are questions about the use of words like ought, if then, and so on. And the other was, but Carnap never talked about philosophy of language. Philosophy was metalinguistic, that was his view. The new way of words, but philosophy of language was not a subdivision of philosophy for him. And the other version of the linguistic turn, ultimately rooted in Wittgenstein, but the avatar of it was Austin, was Oxford linguistic philosophy, which again did philosophy by looking at the use of words. But again, it didn't talk about philosophy of language. It was using careful attention to ordinary language to do philosophy. Neither of those two versions of the linguistic turn thought or talked in terms of a subfield of philosophy that was philosophy of language. And yet, in 1950, Sellers asked himself what he's trying to do is saying, well, I'm trying to get the basic concepts of, an outline of a philosophy of language. He, at that point, would have used the phrase philosophy of science, and this was parallel to the newly emerging subdiscipline of philosophy of science. The phrase philosophy of mind was given currency really by Gilbert Ryle as a subdivision of philosophy. Philosophical psychology, they might have said before, but the idea of a subdiscipline, that's also pretty much a 40s and 50s addition to things. So, I mean, this is something when just, it's sort of so second nature to us. Oh, he's doing philosophy of language here, but that was really already pretty avant-garde to be thinking in those terms. Yeah.
Was it popular to think of doing philosophy and any sort of subdisciplines, you know, like the typical ones we might think of just as metaphysics and epistemology, and were people apt to talk in that way in terms of like those broader subdisciplines?
Certainly epistemology
Yeah.
was, and history of philosophy was distinguished. Ethics, they would have said, we've sort of broadened it out to value theory, but ethics, logic, epistemology, those were subdisciplines of philosophy, with their characteristic problems and figures and so on. But these other ones, newfangled. As I say, from in the 19th century, philosophical psychology would have been the phrase rather than philosophy of mind. That really came on later. Okay, now what you see in the handout is selected passages to begin with, and mostly from this outline of the philosophy of language, but then starting over on page 4, from the pure pragmatics and epistemology essay. And I've given you this is now the third set of passages I've passed around. I will continue doing this. I want just to make a brief remark that this is the way I find it most useful to get on top of a text, is to be reading it and copying out the passages that seem to be moving the argument along, or particularly clearly stating a view in it, and then working on those passages rather than on the whole text to get sort of the next understanding of the thing in a more processable, surveyable form, depending on how many sort of hermeneutic cycles through this one is going to do. At a certain point, you do want to go back and read the whole thing because you understand it better now you're thinking about it, and there may be bits that didn't jump out the first time that will later on. But the idea is to boil it down and get something that is processable. And so I just recommend this as a way of working contemporary texts, The Mighty Dead, some literature, if one's reading everybody talking about pluralism and grounding theory, well, then you've got 5 articles that you're reading, and again, I'm going to be pulling passages out of them and getting them where I can just focus and think about those passages as a way of trying to make progress, rearrange them, and so on. So that's just a methodological heuristic, I guess. Okay, so philosophy of language, rather than Carnapian calculi and linguistic philosophy, I see this thing as having 3 big divisions of it. The first short one, it's really just the first of these 8 single-spaced pages, is about possible worlds. And the second one is about norms, rules, roles, and necessities. And the third one is about aboutness. What it is for a rule to be binding on an individual, and what it is for a language or a story in a language to be about a world, to be in a semantic relation to the world. It may be that the third section from the fragment that we had was going to address modality. But if so, he didn't give us the, because that comes up in the fragment that we do have, but he didn't leave us enough for us to see about that. Okay, so with the possible worlds. Now again, no one used the term possible worlds basically between Leibniz and this text. C.I. Lewis, in doing his modal logics, didn't talk about this at all. That was pure axiomatic proof theory, lay down some axioms about necessity represented by the box and possibility represented by the diamond, some rules like the S5 rule, that if it's possible that something's necessary, then it's necessary that it's necessary, and see what follows from it. What can you prove from these things? He's the one who gave these names, System 5, System 4, that's what the S is for. But though he was talking about possibility and necessity, there are no worlds involved in it. Carnap, who began to get a grip on how an empiricist, not on the epistemological question of how do you know about these modal things, but as somebody who sees philosophical questions as empirically respectable because they're meta-linguistic questions about empirical languages, first gets comfortable with semantic vocabulary from Tarski's treatment of truth and model theory, and then inspired by Tarskian model theory in the 40s, culminating in Meaning and Necessity, that was published in 49, talks about lawfulness and necessity, brings alethic modality into the meta-language of discussing scientific empirical languages. But he does it entirely using state descriptions. So the meta-language looks at maximal state descriptions, so maximal consistent sets of sentences in an empirically meaningful language of the sort he's been talking about in his other work, and talks about how to introduce the notion of what's necessarily true in a state description is what's true in all the maximal state descriptions in the language. What's possible is what's true in some of them, and on that basis can make sense of some modal language. But he doesn't talk about worlds at all. It's all structures of language assembled in a meta-language. Now, Sellers moves immediately to worlds. And he goes two ways at this point. On the one hand, he identifies reality with the collection of all the possible worlds, not just with the actual world. But he treats the actual world as just one among these possible worlds. So I'm seeing sort of three moves here, talking about possible worlds rather than just about state descriptions. Seeing the actual world as a possible world. Carnap had talked about true state descriptions, the ones that are true of the actual world, Carnap had talked about. But he didn't think the actual world was a state description, that's an essential feature of the move to thinking of possible worlds. And he didn't think of reality as a set of state descriptions. Carnap didn't. No, there was a semantic relation between the state descriptions and at least the true ones and the world. Furthermore, and I'm just in awe of Sellers sort of the first time through being able to make this move. He says the distinction between the actual world and the other possible worlds is an indexical one. He sees actual as an indexical expression. Now this, when David Lewis did it in 1970, was a huge conceptual advance. For Lewis, it was part of what he called his self-description as a mad dog modal realist. That the only difference between the actual world and other possible worlds is that this is the world I'm in. It's the world picked out indexically by the term actual, which is the world in which that expression is tokened as I am the one picked out as the speaker of this very token of I. And Sellers just, in passing, says this in this incredibly compressed first page of discussion. And in the very same, under the very same number, says, and that means that the notion of actuality is not a semantic notion, it's a pragmatic notion. Because it has to do with the use of the expressions, the tokenings of the expressions. So he both, and says, these indexical expressions don't fit in semantics proper. They really belong to a pragmatic meta-language. And that's what he's going to be using to discuss all these things, as a pragmatic meta-language, because that's the only one in which you can discuss the difference between an actual world and any of the other possible worlds. I say, Lewis argued, look, because we're ignorant of some things about our world, I'm not looking behind me and I don't know whether the door is open or shut. I don't know about the actual world, whether the door is now open or shut. It's possible that it's open, it's possible that it's not. I can't tell whether the actual world, the one I'm in, is a door shut world or a door open world. So I can't tell the difference between being in the actual world and being in a nearby possible world, well then don't tell me that this talk of possibilities is talk about sets of sentences or state descriptions or whatever. I can't tell them apart. I can't tell which one I'm in. The others have to be concrete particulars like this world, or I'd be able to tell which one I was in. Oh, suddenly I find myself in all these sentences. No, I know it's not that. I'm here. This is part of Lewis's argument for thinking of the possible worlds as just like this one. That's why you can't tell which one you're in, except causally unconnected to this universe. This, of course, gave him some, if your ontology is like this, you have epistemological problems. How is it that I know anything about these causally disconnected other worlds? At least with the sentences, well, all right, state descriptions are sort of abstract object, there's epistemological issues about those, but not as bad as concrete spatiotemporal items that are not just outside of our light cone, but are spatiotemporally disconnected and so causally disconnected. And so, for Lewis, this indexical move was part and parcel of a modal realism. Sorry, there was a question.
Yeah, I was wondering if you had a take on what the referent of the indexical this is here. I mean, it's a somewhat strange way of using the expression. There's two possible readings, I guess. Maybe there's more, but one is that this is referring to the token of the inscription this. So it's this tokening of this. Or the other one is this document or something like that.
I mean,
I don't know
I read it the first way.
Okay.
That the underlining was telling us that this was a token reflexive expression, and he meant this tokening of it. In EPM, so just 6 years later, he uses that Reichenbach expression, token reflexive. I don't know whether he had, knew about that use at the time he wrote this. He doesn't in any of these early things where he is talking about tokens. He doesn't talk about token reflexive expressions. That's from Reichenbach coined this, I think, already in the 20s, but certainly by the early 30s. That book had been published, so people who cared about it could have that. This comes up again in the discussion of aboutness later on, this question. Well, Sellers' possible worlds are, if not, they don't seem to be linguistic items. That's the distinction between possible worlds and state descriptions, which he is explicitly making here. Remember in the thing we read last week, the Epistemology in a New Way of Words, he has a footnote, Meaning and Necessity. Carnap's book hadn't come out yet, so I hadn't seen it. Well, it had come out, and he had seen it by the time he's writing this, so he had the sort of official version. Carnap published Introduction to Semantics in 1942, and waves his hands at state descriptions there, but you couldn't really see what he wanted to do with them until the later book. But he talks about them as states of affairs, and that seems to be a Tractarian expression that he's using to contrast with sort of specifically linguistic items. But it's interesting that he says that those states of affairs are the senses of, this is in 1.341, true state descriptions have the real states of affairs as their senses, not as their reference. If indeed he means to be making that distinction here. He paraphrases sense as meaning, but it's not obvious to me why. I mean, he also talks about the relation between these as being one of designation when we get to the aboutness portion of this. And designation is a reference-like notion, not a sense-like notion. Does he mean the sense-reference distinction here? Most philosophers had not read Frege's Übersinn und Bedeutung, even during the 60s, until the 60s. So my guess is that he was not thinking sense-reference here. It was Geach's Three Philosophers book that collected that. That was in the 50s that people really read that. They sort of knew it existed, but it wasn't something people had read.
I'm not sure if this is directly relevant, but I mean, one of the things that confused me about some of Seller's terminology is that he does use things like stand for in lots of his other works, which is intuitively thought of as a reference notion to be a sense notion. So he'll talk about I'm not sure if how he uses designate, but
Right.
if he's using it like stand for, then it's possible that it's more of a sense notion than a reference notion. But
Yeah, well, I agree, and this, as you indicate, this continues to be true. I guess he gets careful about it in Science and Metaphysics, and I don't think he does before that. And when I say he gets careful about it, it doesn't mean it's obvious how to map what he's saying onto, if there's one of the things that John and I certainly agree about is that almost nobody knows what they mean by sense and reference. And in any case, if they do, it isn't what Frege meant. John and I disagree strongly about what Frege did mean, but I guess what I'm saying is I don't think there's a standard way of actually understanding those expressions, even now where we've read Frege a lot more carefully than they had. So it's not surprising, and he's not alone in not sorting these things out. Yeah.
So I'm quite confused about what the upshot of, in his view, this stuff is supposed to be. So if there's a sort of blurriness about whether it's talking about sense or reference, or whether there's even a distinction there for him to be making, and then also calling the indexical actual as a pragmatic indexical rather than like a bit of semantic language, right? Is that supposed to be deflationary in a certain way? Like, are we supposed to think of him as like having motivations like Lewis, but then throwing the realism under the bus?
Well, I think he is observing that the way everybody's thinking about semantics at this point, the use of indexicals doesn't fall under semantics. It's not studied by semantics. So Tarskian model theory doesn't give you any way of understanding this and I and so on. And we wouldn't really, until Kaplan in the 60s, know how to use even possible world version of Tarskian model theory to get indexicals. Or token reflexive expressions generally. So I'm reading that as saying something about how he's using the notion of a pragmatic meta-language. And the way he's using it, I think, if you have to think about the actual use of expressions, that's what you talk about in a pragmatic meta-language. If you just talk about truth conditions or what's designated by something, that's a semantic matter. But that you can talk about the expression as a type in his sense of a type, which is a lexical syntactic type with the normative role that it plays associated with it. I guess his view is that as soon as you talk about it as in terms of the role that it's playing in a language is used, that you've got to do in the pragmatic meta vocabulary. So I guess it's going to follow, and he makes this distinction of 3 levels in section 10 of the PPE essay. It's at the bottom of page 5. That it's going to be and he did in the other essay, it's going to be the token class, type as a token class that stands in semantic relations. And to understand why it stands in those semantic relations, we have to go in the pragmatic meta-language. But the statement that it designates this thing, that's a semantic statement. Okay, so I've really observed 6 things here about this. That he's using possible world rather than state description, and that these are not, at any rate, linguistic items in a strict sense, that they're not sets of words, that the actual world is just one of them, that it's picked out indexically and therefore pragmatically, in a pragmatic meta-vocabulary, that the relation between a state description and a state of affairs in a possible world is a sense relation, but whether that contrasts with a reference relation, we don't know. Those are the observations I've made so far. I want to make one more. He says, the worlds come in families, and they share their primitive predicates. All the worlds in a family have the same primitive predicates. So there's a red in not just the actual world, but in other possible worlds in the same family as our actual world. These are the primitive predicates that we'll discover he thinks are these primitive properties in the families of possible worlds are referred to by primitive predicates in the language, which are implicitly defined by what he calls conformation rules, the kind that he adds to Carnapian formation and transformation rules. I'm going to talk about that later on. But each world has its own private set of particulars. The predicates are common, not, he's thinking, to all possible worlds, but to families of possible worlds. They're going to be identified and individuated by the laws that relate them, those properties. This same year, he writes an essay called Concepts as Involving Laws and Inconceivable Without Them, about which I usually say it's a long essay, 80 pages or so, and I usually say, and that sentential title is the last intelligible sentence in that essay. I mean, that's obviously polemical and overstated. But the reason I didn't have us read it is it just is a mess that one jumps into. Yeah.
Yeah, so I know that like later, in fact, like 2 years later in particulars, he drives a strong wedge between particulars and properties. But like so here, I mean, he obviously is driving some sort of wedge between them because particulars can't be common to multiple worlds, whereas properties can. In 1950, is he thinking of them as sharply different as he does in particulars, or is it just...
I think he is, and I think the other essays he does the same thing. There's a fundamental semantic difference for him between the way predicates designate what they designate, which we're to understand in terms of the confirmation rules, and what he calls in the other ones individual constants, which are going to designate these particulars, which don't have anything that stands to them as the confirmation rules stand to the predicates. And I think this distinction reverberates throughout his scientific naturalism. Certainly it's an important ingredient of what gets developed in his nominalism, his claim that in the narrow sense, properties don't exist and states of affairs don't exist. In the narrow sense, all there is in the world is the particulars in it. And he's already thinking in a way that is going to flower into that, parenthetically, I will claim, actually unintelligible view, but it's deeply unintelligible, not unintelligible on the surface. I mean, you have to, oh yeah, that doesn't make any sense. You can't just see it. Anyway, so I will claim. But already here, he has this. Yeah.
Another question about the history of the development of his attitudes. Do you think that at this point there is already a root to his idea that the designation relation is not one of between language and world? Is that something you would say is already present, or is that still to come?
I don't think he endorses that yet, but I think we may see seeds of it, and that's sort of one of the things that's interesting about this, I think, is that he clearly has moved on in here in his thinking about designation and aboutness from the New Way of Words essay. So I take his thought to be in rapid development at this point. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess then, since if he is thinking of properties in this way as sort of conveying like or property talk conveying like these metalinguistic norms, then like so I guess presumably that's sort of what grounds the laws in the actual world, right?
Well, I mean, what we'll see sort of as we move sort of in my heading to the norms,
Yeah.
and so on, is they're norms that are implicit and get made explicit in rules in a meta language, and they, he says, correspond to necessities. And he doesn't tell us anything more about that kind of correspondence. The paradigm of it is the way logical necessities correspond to L rules, which codify logical norms. And those necessities are, well, laws of logic, I guess, non-contradiction, excluded middle is the sort of example. But we would like to know exactly what that correspondence is to the thing. And anyway, how is he thinking about the logical necessities relative to what's in the worlds? But he says, in the same way, if what we're talking about is the P rules, the confirmation, in Carnap's sense, the confirmation rules that state laws of nature, which articulate the necessities, the melting point of copper and so on, that make copper the substance that it is, it's a sort of predicate, but it is a predicate that it is. Those, he just says, well, they correspond to or are designated by the laws here. He's not using designation talk for modal vocabulary, for the laws. He doesn't get that far here, but sort of what is that correspondence notion?
Yeah, I guess the worry I'm having is that if you have like this, family of possible worlds and they're a family because they share laws, but if you have sort of people with different, like if concepts differ in different parts of this family, does the family look different from that world or something?
I mean, I think his view is that what I was just about to say, now I'm thinking, is this right or not, is that to be in the same family, they have to share all the same necessities, all the same confirmation rules. But I'm given pause because I think he doesn't actually say that, I think. Worlds come in families, a set of simple characteristics. Well, does it have to be a maximal set to be a family? That's the question. He doesn't actually say it. Is that all and only the simple properties of a world that it has to share with another world in order for them to be in the same family, or could smaller ones do it? He doesn't actually say here. I'd been thinking of it the other way. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to observe about this, the particulars don't repeat, is that this too is a David Lewis view. Not only is the indexicality of actual a David Lewis view, but it's distinctive of Lewis to say each thing can only be in one world. There can be counterparts, but you can only be in this world. Counterpart you can be in other worlds. And this has significant consequences for the way you do modal logic. Kripke implicitly spends a lot of time in Naming a Necessity making fun of this view. But never mounted an argument that Lewis found compelling. But we've come to realize it's a big dividing point in how you think about possible worlds, whether you think that in addition to them being able to share properties, they can share individuals or not. And the Lewisian view is the view that Sellers, without argument, says here, but it seems to be part of the structure of the way he's thinking of it. I don't think anybody else would be in a position to worry about this for 15 years. When people, maybe earlier, Quine in the mid-50s is already worried about Barkin formulae, whether you can move, after Ruth Barkin, Marcus as was, whether you can move modal operators past quantifiers or not. So whether there was a difference between properties that are had essentially and just the necessity of the truth of sentences. And it wasn't really until late 60s that we even had the logic of these quantified modal logics straight. And those are the issues that are treated differently by a counterpart theory than by a theory that allows you to repeat objects as well. So, these are deep waters that he is dipping his toe into, and things that I'm really pretty sure nobody else was worrying about at this point. Okay, why don't we take 15 minutes, come back at 3, and I'll talk about the norms and the aboutness.